The life of Empress Elisabeth of Austria, better known as Sissi, was far from a fairy tale. Many would say she had it all: comfort, wealth, beauty, and power, and yes, she possessed everything anyone could ever dream of. Yet her existence was profoundly unhappy from the very moment she became empress. She had to leave her family behind and adapt to a foreign court where every gesture, every word, and every detail of her behavior was carefully watched and harshly judged. Her greatest torment came from her own aunt, who was also her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie. From the very beginning, everything between them seemed doomed to conflict. Sophie had always wanted her son, Emperor Franz Joseph, to marry Helene, Sissi's older sister, not her. From that day on, Sophie was convinced that Sissi lacked the strength, discipline, and sense of duty required to be an empress, or at least the kind of empress she had imagined. After the wedding, Sissi felt unbearably lonely in the court of Vienna. The Archduchess watched her every move, correcting even the smallest mistake. And on top of that, Sissi carried the heavy burden that all queens must bear: the duty to give birth to a male heir. That expectation haunted her from the very first day. But fate seemed to smile upon her, for only 2 weeks after the wedding, she discovered she was pregnant. In due time, a baby girl was born, Sophie Friederike Dorothea Maria Josefa. Yet that long-awaited child would become the center of a fierce conflict between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, a wound that would never heal. And as if that weren't enough, tragedy would soon strike without warning, sweeping everything away in its path. From that moment on, fear, sorrow, and guilt would follow Sissi until the end of her days. Today, we'll uncover the story behind the short and tragic life of Little Sophie of Austria, the first daughter of Empress Sissi and Emperor Franz Joseph. During her pregnancy, the tension between Sissi and her mother-in-law grew unbearable. Once again, she found herself isolated and tightly controlled within Habsburg Palace, her official residence. The emperor had little time for his young wife. The Crimean War consumed his attention, and the growing political rift between Austria and Russia left him deeply troubled. Archduchess Sophie treated her daughter-in-law with the same iron severity as always, but now, with the pregnancy, she became even more overbearing. Determined to show the world that Austria's next heir was on the way, she demanded that Sissi display her belly proudly wherever she went. Years later, Elizabeth would recall with pain, "Whenever she arrived, she made me walk down to the garden just so she could tell me that my duty was to show off my belly, so everyone would see that I was truly expecting. It was awful, and every time she left, I felt an immense relief, because then, finally, I could cry in peace." Sophie, filled with hope for the arrival of a future crown prince, became ever more controlling, ever more intrusive. Nothing escaped her scrutiny. On June 29, 1854, the Archduchess wrote a letter to her son, the Emperor, saying, "I believe Sissi shouldn't spend so much time with her parrots, because during the first months of pregnancy, it's dangerous to be near certain animals. The baby might be born with their face. She should look at herself in the mirror more often. Or look at you. If she does, my dear son, I will be very pleased." That's what Archduchess Sophie wrote, and along with those words, she issued yet another strict order. Sissi was forbidden from being near her beloved dogs, the majestic Great Danes who followed her everywhere and slept every night at the foot of her bed. Sissi was barely 17 when on March 5th, 1855, she gave birth to a strong and healthy baby girl. The child was named after her grandmother, Sophie. It was also the Archduchess herself who became the baby's godmother, personally deciding every detail of the baptism. The emperor, her son, approved everything without a word of objection. Yet no one stopped to ask Sissi's opinion, not even about the name of her first daughter. Curiously, Sissi's mother, the Duchess Ludovica, was absent from that deeply important moment. Some claimed it was her own choice, that she feared outshining her domineering sister, the Archduchess Sophie. Others insisted it was Sophie who forbade her attendance. declaring that she alone would take care of everything. Whatever the truth, Ludovica's absence at the birth of her first grandchild became a topic of much discussion. She wouldn't meet the little girl until nearly 6 months later. In the meantime, the Archduchess was radiant. She grew deeply attached to the baby and decided to have the child's room set up in her own chambers. Her excuse was that Sissi was too young and inexperienced, and that her main duty as empress was to give the empire a male heir. That decision was a devastating blow for Sissi, who once again found no support from her husband. Franz Joseph, as always, chose to side with his mother. Sophie, who had the habit of writing daily in her journal about political affairs, began filling its pages with notes about her granddaughter, her first smile, her first teeth, her little games. Years earlier, she had lost her only daughter, Mariana, when the child was just 4 years old. Perhaps that loss was why she clung so tightly to this little girl, as if she were a second chance. A year later, Sissi became pregnant again. To the emperor's disappointment, for he longed for a son, she gave birth to another girl, Gisela. But this time, it was Sissi who chose the name. She was truly happy with the birth of her daughters. For the first time since arriving at the Viennese court, she could be seen smiling, genuinely, and from the heart. But that happiness would not last. Her mother-in-law intervened once more. Still convinced that her daughter-in-law lacked the maturity and discipline to raise the future princesses, Sophie insisted that Sissi's duty was to devote herself entirely to the emperor and to the Austrian people, not to motherhood. And with that reasoning, she took charge again. She ordered that Gisela's nursery be placed next to her sister's, inside her own quarters, and forbade Sissi from breastfeeding her children. Determined to educate them according to the strict traditions of the Viennese court, the Archduchess imposed her will without hesitation. The tension between mother and daughter-in-law soon became unbearable. Sissi protested desperate, crying out that her daughters were her own, that she had the right to raise them. But the emperor responded with chilling calm. "Things must remain as my mother has arranged them." It was a situation no mother could bear. Each time Sissi wished to see her daughters, she had to walk through the endless corridors of the palace, all the way to her mother-in-law's apartments, far from her own. She could only visit at the exact hour the Archduchess allowed, and under no circumstance was she ever permitted to be alone with the children. There were always servants, governesses, or visitors present, watching every gesture, every word. The empress felt utterly ignored and humiliated, stripped of any right to even choose the nannies who would care for her own daughters. The Archduchess had also imposed her choice of physician, Dr. Zaborer, a man whose outdated and absurd medical practices Sissi deeply distrusted. What tormented her most was the health of her eldest, Little Sophie, who seemed weaker with each passing day. The child vomited frequently, and the empress felt, instinctively, that something was terribly wrong. And she was right. The room where the girls slept was damp, dark, and without ventilation. The doctor believed that fresh air and changes in temperature were dangerous for them, so the windows remained shut, day and night. At that time, Sissi was still a timid, insecure young woman, too submissive to her husband and terrified of her mother-in-law. But as the suffering grew unbearable, she decided to fight for the love of her daughters. She begged Franz Joseph to intervene, to put an end to such injustice. Moved by his wife's despair, the emperor finally gathered the courage to write to his mother. In his letter, he said, "I sincerely beg you, dear mother, to be fairer with Sissi. She is such a devoted wife and mother. If you reflect calmly, perhaps you will understand the pain we feel in seeing our daughters practically confined to their rooms, while poor Sissi can hardly ever see them, and almost never alone. Moreover, Sissi has no wish to deprive you of their company. She has asked me, in fact, to assure you that the children will always remain at your disposal." For the first time, Franz Joseph dared to defy the powerful Archduchess Sophie. But his gesture came at a price. Enraged at the thought of losing control over her granddaughters, Sophie threatened to leave the Habsburg palace forever. Though she never followed through, the little girls were finally moved closer to their mother. Yet the Archduchess did not surrender. She remained determined to preserve her influence over them. From that moment on, she tormented Sissi even more, demanding that she give the empire a male heir. Having given birth to 2 daughters, already made her increasingly unwelcome at court. One day, upon returning to her chambers, the Empress found an anonymous pamphlet lying on her desk. It read, "The natural destiny of a queen is to give an heir to the throne. If she is fortunate enough to offer the state a prince, that must be the end of her ambition. She must not, under any circumstance, meddle in affairs of government. Those are not the business of women. If the queen bears no children, she is nothing but a foreigner in the kingdom, and a dangerous one. For never being truly welcomed, she will seek to win the king's favor by other unnatural means. She will fight for position and power, sowing intrigue and discord, to the misfortune of the king, the nation, and the empire." Those cruel, anonymous words captured exactly what many at court whispered behind closed doors. And what Sissi feared most, that she was seen not as an empress, but as a stranger, in a world that would never fully accept her. The note bore no signature, but everyone suspected the hand behind it was that of the Archduchess Sophie. Meanwhile, amid Austria's fragile political isolation after the end of the Crimean War, and with the rise of nationalist movements threatening the empire's unity, the emperor resolved to reassert his authority over his most rebellious provinces, Lombardy and Venice. In the winter of 1856, Franz Joseph and his wife set out on a long journey across the Habsburg domains in Italy, determined to show the world the military strength of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The voyage lasted 4 long months. Sissi couldn't bear the thought of being away from her daughters for so long, but the Archduchess Sophie insisted that the little girls must not accompany them. In the end, Sissi managed to bring the young Sophie along, though she was forced to leave Gisela behind in Vienna. During their stay, the imperial couple resided in the ancient palaces of Milan and Venice, where they displayed all the splendor of their court. Yet Sissi, accustomed to the warm receptions of Vienna, quickly sensed the heavy tension that filled those lands. Despite every effort to appear friendly and gracious, what they met was distrust and quiet resentment. The Italian people had grown weary of foreign rule, and the public appearances of the emperor and empress, always surrounded by an imposing military escort, were seen not as gestures of goodwill, but as acts of provocation. Even so, Elizabeth faced her role with dignity. Despite the hostility that surrounded her, she never shied away from official events and accompanied her husband even to the military parades. The most uncomfortable moment came in Venice, when the sovereigns entered the majestic Basilica of St. Mark. They were greeted not with cheers, but with a chilling silence, deep, unsettling, almost defiant. The British consul in the city later wrote in his report to London, "The people came out into the streets only to see the Empress. Her beauty is truly legendary." A few weeks after their visit to Italy, the imperial couple departed for Hungary. Relations between Vienna and Budapest had been deeply strained ever since 1848, when the Hungarian aristocracy's rebellion was brutally crushed and many nobles were executed. The Viennese court, ruled by the iron hand of Archduchess Sophie, was openly hostile toward Hungary. But Sissi felt a profound sympathy for its people. She admired their pride, their courage, and their indomitable spirit. The visit was risky, but the emperor trusted that his wife's charm and elegance would win Hungarian hearts. This time, Sissi insisted on bringing both her daughters, since the trip would last 4 months. That decision led to yet another clash with her mother-in-law, who strongly opposed exposing the children to such a long journey, and to the damp climate of the Danube, which she considered dangerous. But for the first time, Sissi prevailed. The little girls traveled with their parents. The journey followed the majestic Danube River, all the way to what is now Budapest, though at the time, the two cities of Buda and Pest remained divided, not yet united until 1873. Sissi was enchanted by Hungary, a land that would forever hold a special place in her heart. The reception was warm and respectful, Despite the political tension, her elegance, her poise, and above all, her passion for horseback riding captivated the Hungarian people. On one occasion, while attending a military parade beside her husband, the Empress suddenly decided to mount a horse herself. The crowd erupted in applause, thrilled by her courage and grace. But the members of the Viennese court were horrified. They saw her gesture as scandalous, utterly unbecoming of a sovereign. And from that day on, their disdain for Sissi only grew stronger. However, that first official visit of the Empress to Hungary would be forever marked by tragedy. Just as the imperial couple was preparing to tour the Hungarian provinces, little Sophie, barely 2 years old, fell gravely ill. She had a fever, with signs of dysentery. Despite her parents' growing concern, Dr. Zeeborger reassured them that it was nothing serious, merely the usual discomforts of teething. But the child's condition worsened with each passing day. The journey inland was canceled, and Sissi never left her daughter's side, not for a single moment. The little girl grew weaker and weaker, until, after 12 agonizing hours, she stopped crying and took her final breath, dying in her mother's arms. She had most likely succumbed to dehydration brought on by severe diarrhea, or perhaps to convulsions caused by the relentless fever. Yet many believed the true cause of her death was typhoid fever. Sissi was utterly shattered. Between sobs, she cursed the doctor, blaming him for her daughter's death, and sank into a state of complete despair. Franz Joseph, stunned and helpless, could only watch the heartbreaking scene, his wife weeping, holding the lifeless body of their little girl. Our little one is now in her heavenly home. We are completely broken. Sissi has surrendered to the will of the Lord. The emperor telegraphed to his mother, the Archduchess Sophie. The imperial couple immediately returned to Vienna with their entourage, carrying with them the small coffin that held their child's remains. After the tragedy, the empress demanded the dismissal of Dr. Zeeborger, whom she saw as outdated, incompetent, and responsible for her daughter's death. But her mother-in-law would not allow it. The physician, highly respected at the Viennese court, kept his position. The little Archduchess Sophie of Habsburg-Lorraine, just 2 years old, was laid out and solemnly buried in the imperial crypt of the Capuchins in Vienna, the final resting place of the House of Habsburg. Following the doctor's advice, Franz Joseph decided that his wife should not attend the funeral, fearing that her fragile health might deteriorate even further. During her long, sorrowful mourning, Sissi lacked the strength to visit her daughter's grave. But in September of 1858, her cousin Margaret of Saxony, the young wife of one of Franz Joseph's brothers, passed away at just 18. Sissi, who had loved her dearly, decided to attend the funeral in the Capuchin crypt, despite her frail condition. In truth, her real reason for going was to see at last the resting place of her child. She descended a narrow shadowed staircase lit only by torches into that solemn burial chamber that held the sarcophagi of Austria's royals. What she found was a chilling sight, a cold, damp cellar, the final destination of every Habsburg. In that moment, Sissi became haunted by the thought of death. She often said she did not wish to be buried in the imperial crypt. Yet even in death, she could not escape the rigid traditions of the Viennese court, and many years later, her body too would be laid to rest in that same dark, somber mausoleum of her family. After the sudden loss of her daughter, the empress sank into a deep depression that would mark her life forever. She was inconsolable, isolating herself from the world, weeping endlessly, and over time, refusing to eat. Nothing and no one could ease the abyss of guilt she felt for having exposed her little girl to such a dangerous journey. Although her mother-in-law never dared to openly reproach her, deep down, she blamed her, and she would never forgive her for what had happened. From that moment on, the relationship between the two women grew colder, more distant, and more hostile, sealing forever a wound that would never heal. Sissi eventually began to believe her mother-in-law's words, convinced that she truly was an unfit mother. She gave up caring for her other daughter, Gisela, who was barely 11 months old. She stopped worrying about the child and accepted that Archduchess Sophie would take full charge of her upbringing. That summer of 1857, Sissi's condition had become so alarming that her mother, Duchess Ludovica, traveled from Possenhofen to Vienna in an attempt to comfort her. She was accompanied by the family's old physician, Dr. Fischer, in whom the Empress placed absolute trust. But not even the presence of her mother and siblings could bring a glimmer of joy back into her life. It was also during that period of grief that Emperor Franz Joseph's brother, Archduke Maximilian, one of Sissi's closest friends, married Charlotte, the daughter of the King of Belgium. Sissi's new sister-in-law was not only beautiful and intelligent, but also immensely wealthy, with an impeccable royal lineage. Yet neither Sissi nor Franz Joseph attended the wedding, still mourning the death of their daughter. Archduchess Sophie, however, never tired of praising her new daughter-in-law's virtues, her education, her refinement, her poise, constantly comparing her to Sissi. And in doing so, she only fueled a fierce rivalry between the two young women, making her preferences painfully clear. By the end of that terrible year, 1857, Sissi's situation at court had grown even more difficult. She was increasingly unpopular and seemed to lack the strength to face anything, until news arrived that would change everything. The Empress was expecting a child. The entire court erupted in joy. Everyone rushed to congratulate her. On August 21st, 1858, at her residence in Luxembourg, Sissi gave birth to the long-awaited heir to the imperial throne. The boy was baptized Rudolph in honor of the first emperor of the Habsburg dynasty. His birth was cause for immense celebration, both at court and among the people, who received generous gifts from the crown in honor of the occasion. The emperor presented his wife with a magnificent 3-strand pearl necklace. The day after the birth, Franz Joseph named his newborn son a colonel of the army and declared, with emotion, "I wish that the son God has granted me may belong to my brave army from the very moment he comes into this world." The emperor had already decided, whether she liked it or not, his son would be a soldier. While everyone around her celebrated, for Sissi, the moment was bittersweet. Barely a year had passed since little Sophie's death, and though she begged to nurse her own son, she was forbidden to do so. Rudolph was entrusted to a wet nurse chosen by Archduchess Sophie, and from birth he was raised under the strict discipline of the court, as befit a future heir. The depression never left her. The death of her beloved daughter, under such cruel circumstances, haunted her endlessly, with pain, guilt, fear, and an infinite sadness. She would never recover from that loss. It was very likely that this tragedy shaped her destiny. From then on, Sissi would try to flee, far from the court, far from her husband, from her mother-in-law, even from her own children, far from everyone, far from herself.